I would like to thank the AR and AJ and every member of the W Awards committee and jury for honoring me with the Ada Louise Huxtable Prize. For this, I'm truly, truly grateful. It is very heartwarming for me to receive recognition from an organization whose aim is to celebrate women's achievements. Because even today, I'm sad to say, it's still an enormous struggle for women to have their contribution in every area of life fully appreciated and acknowledged. It's also nice to get recognition from a discipline other than my own. It feels like being adopted by a new family, and it's something very heartwarming about it. My own practice started off being very far from architecture. In the 80s, I worked mostly in the area of performance and video with particular focus on the body and issues of surveillance, as well as confinement, conflict, and displacement. One of the first things that struck me when I got to London in the mid-70s was how you are constantly being watched by the eye of Big Brother. This led me, when I was a student at the Slade School of Art in early 80s, to the writings of Foucault and the architecture of surveillance and control, and the concept of the panopticon devised by Jeremy Bentham. The funny thing is that being at University College London, I discovered that Jeremy Bentham's effigy was actually in the same building. He was given pride of place in the main hall of the university. So that was very uncanny. So from the 90s onwards, I returned many times to these themes through making large-scale immersive environments or sculptural works that offer a physical experience that can trigger thoughts and associations with issues of confinement or institutional control occurring either here or elsewhere. I'm going to show a selection of a dozen of works that touch on these themes. So to start with, large installations that deal with containment and barriers using the grid and repeated modules, which are typical minimal devices. Sorry. The light at the end, an early example of site-specific installation. This work was inspired by the peculiar wedge-like shape of the room at the back of the showroom gallery when it was actually located in Bethnal Green. We're talking about 1989 here. I blocked the narrow end of the room with this gate structure, creating a small cell-like space at the far end of the room. So from a distance, it looked like a Dan Flavin installation with fluorescent tubes. Also, the title refers to light, in the sense it's called The Light at the End, and sets up a hopeful, positive expectation that is completely disrupted when you approach the work. Getting close to the structure, you start experiencing an intense heat, and you realize that what was perceived from a distance as bars of light are actually red-hot electric heating elements that can burn you to the bone. So it becomes something dangerous that brings up images of imprisonment, torture, and pain. But there's something quite tempting and seductive. It's like moth being drawn to the light, and people always like to stick their hands between the bars, and it's a bit like playing with fire. So it sets up conflicting emotions in the viewer of attraction and repulsion, fascination and fear. Light Sentence, which was mentioned earlier here. This is from 1992. The title here is a play on words, as in prison sentence, but not a heavy one. These are wire mesh lockers above human height. On the one hand, they look like animal cages. For me, the structure also looks like an architectural model of a city lined up with the kind of uniform, functional, and box-like architecture typical of social housing that one comes across in suburbs of large cities. Ironically, in France, they actually refer to them as cage à lapin, which means rabbits' cages, or cité dortoir. Not the architects behind these projects were not as inspired as the architects I have come across today, because they were not thinking about they were not thinking about making the environment pleasant for the people. It was more about housing the biggest number of people. In the middle of the structure, there is a single naked light bulb that moves very slowly up and down, making the shadows of the wire mesh lockers continuously move, and your own silhouette becomes enmeshed in these shadows. It looks like a searchlight in a prison, penetrating every corner of the cages, and the movement creates a very unsettling feeling. It makes you feel like the whole room is swaying and the ground is shifting under your feet. So my giving it the title Light Sentence is like existing in those kind of environments. It's like having a sentence, but a light one, a prison sentence, but not a heavy one, you know. So this is an environment in constant flux. There's a sense of instability and restlessness in the space. But there's also something mesmerizing about the fluidity of the shadows that break down the rigidity and harshness of the metal cages and the grid structure. So I always like to emphasize that there's always a duality. There's always more than one thing happening, the positive and the negative together. Quarters. I called this work Quarters because it suggests official or institutional lodgings like army quarters or prison quarters. This work was actually inspired by a visit to the Eastern State Penitentiary, a disused prison in Philadelphia, which was built according to the principles of observation from the center, as in the concept of the panopticon. Here's where I actually came across the bunk beds, which are reproduced in taller structures of nearly 3 meters in height, with 5 bunk beds to each unit. With the condensed space between them, they look more like shelves or racks and give a sense of people living in confined spaces above one another in urban environments. Again, an environment where uniformity and regimentation is predominant. Actually, I made this work in 1996, and now I find when it's being shown these days, people start thinking more about emergency housing or temporary shelter. In a lot of these works, there is a fascination with the grid, an ordered and rational reality, but it's pushed to such an extreme that it becomes dehumanizing. Current Disturbance. This is an installation that was created during a residency at Cap Street project in San Francisco and was built around the columns that were a prominent feature of the space. You can see those heavy wooden columns. So again, that was a site-specific piece. It measured around 3 meters high by 5 meters across. So there are here 240 cages made of wood and wire mesh with a single light bulb in each cage. All the wires from the bulbs converge towards a central control panel. You can just, in this image, you can just see the tangle of wires on the floor. The lights are controlled by a dimmer device that fades them up and down to different intensities, and the sound of the electric current is amplified, so you can see and hear the fluctuations of the current simultaneously. So there's like 3 different buzzing or humming sounds that come up at different times, and there's creates a cacophony of sounds, or noises, I should say. In this work, there is a tension between the strict regimentation of the structure and the erratic activity that takes place within it. It feels like a housing block or a prison where the inmates are rioting. The metaphor of a prison came up mostly because of the location. San Francisco, of course, has Alcatraz just on the island outside. When the same work was shown at the Whitechapel Gallery a number of years ago, there was more of an association with the surrounding council estates. Cellule, this is a work made of cage-like structures constructed from reinforcement bars. They are slightly tilted, giving them the feeling of precariousness and instability, like buildings that are about to topple. Inside each of the structure, there is one or sometimes two amorphous-looking red glass objects. The shapes are ambiguous, as if some strange creature or unspecific body part has been trapped inside each cage. And they look like they are trying to inch their way out. And here there's one that's managed to escape but has been squashed by the building. So here there's a juxtaposition of the roughness of the ribbed metal rods against the smooth, sensuous, and translucent glass shapes. So I always like to have these kind of things sort of opposite each other. Home as a site of the uncanny also figures a lot in my work. In the Freudian concept of the uncanny, the perfectly familiar turns unfamiliar or even threatening because it has become associated with some kind of traumatic experience. For me, it relates to the experience of uncertainty and disorientation of a displaced person trying to negotiate their place and relationship to their new surroundings. One way of making the familiar unfamiliar was playing with the scale of objects. These two pieces of furniture here are both enlargements of kitchen utensils. Paravent is based on a 3-paneled Victorian cheese grater that is enlarged to the size of a room divider, giving it surreal dimensions, and architectural dimensions, if you like. It becomes a menacing barrier that aggressively cuts across the space, implying a hostile environment. Daybed is also a grater with curved ends that is enlarged to the size of a bed that promises discomfort and pain. Homebound, this work uses a collection of kitchen utensils and metal domestic furniture, which are all connected together with electric wires that run to light bulbs controlled by a dimmer device, fluctuating the current and making the bulbs flicker and fade up and down. Also here, the sound of the electric current is amplified, a kind of crackling and buzzing sound going up and down with the fluctuation of the current and adding to the sense of threat. All the objects here are live, electrified, and the whole thing, to protect you, is barricaded behind a fence of stretched wires, creating caged-in space. This is an unwholesome home environment fraught with a sense of threat and danger. You don't know whether the occupants have been driven out of their home or kept away for their own protection. The title Homebound is intentionally ambiguous, referring either to the journey home or the confinement of domesticity or domestic entrapment or being under house arrest. The notion of a barricaded home could even be seen as a reference to a denied homeland. This work is called Remains of the Day, and this was a project which was first conceived for the 10th Hiroshima Art Prize exhibition in 2017. It looks like a domestic environment which has been hit by a sudden disaster. The charred, ghost-like remains of the furniture, held together with wire mesh, look precarious and about to collapse. In the context of Hiroshima, these remains were meant to remind us of the devastation caused by the atomic bomb. But the scene seems universal enough to represent the aftermath of war, violence, or even ecological disasters taking place anywhere in the world today. Bunker This is a large work I created for the basement gallery of White Cube's Mason's Yard space in 2011. So you have what appears to be models of empty and derelict architectural structures. Each building is made up of stacked steel rectangular tube sections that have been subjected to cutting and burning, giving them the appearance of buildings that have been scarred by war. This cityscape looks like it's made up of generic modernist buildings that you find everywhere, but actually more than half of the structures refer specifically to buildings from Beirut. Some of them are still standing in the state they were after the war. It's a bit of an ironic situation because the maquette-like scale of the work suggests plans for a future construction project in which signs of destruction are already present. I have always been interested in modern ruins, which is what I call modern ruins is kind of abandoned building projects that go bankrupt and remain unfinished, or buildings that are destroyed by conflict and war and remain forever a reminder of the violence that has etched its way through the fabric of the city. Remains to be seen, 2019, here chunks of concrete that look like fragments of flooring hang from the ceiling on straight sections of reinforcement steel bars. It looks like the skeleton of a destroyed multi-story building that is left hanging by a thread and makes you reflect on the impermanence of all things. It is both heavy and light. There's a feeling of precariousness, and the broken fragments with jagged edges are nevertheless lined up in a grid formation and contained within the formal geometry of the cube. It feels like order is created out of the chaos of destruction. Another work that uses building materials from the same year is called A Pile of Bricks. I chose these bricks because of their many holes that look like windows in a large apartment building or office block. The stack of bricks is partially gouged, as if the facade has caved in from receiving a direct hit or collapsed because of structural failure, as we see frequently in shoddily built factories and housing projects in places like India and Bangladesh. And finally, to end on a positive note, Hanging Garden. The title is a reference to the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Babylon is, of course, what we know now as Iraq. So walls of sandbags are supposed to be temporary structures used in times of war. Here, the implication is that they have been around for so long that plants have started taking root in them. For me, it's a poetic piece. There's something hopeful about life sprouting out of this most inhospitable environment. Thank you.